Hello, everyone. Welcome to the big conference. I'm so excited for all of you to be here. My name is Kimberly Woods, and I will be helping to guide us through, moderate this session today. We do have a little bit of a shift with our topic and our focus for today. We're going to be looking at experimenting with basic income, alternative methods, and strategies. Otto will be looking into contrasting local experiments with large-scale experiments. And Troy and Ben, they're going to be looking into experience of COVID, analyzing the natural experiment that it was in many spaces, and looking at how we can draw lessons from the evidence to build a national program in these spaces. So I'm going to dive into introducing these guys. We do have, unfortunately, another announcement. Elsie is not going to be making it to our panel today. We hope that all is well. Let's dive right in. One other couple of housekeeping things. These sessions are brought to you by the generous support of our sponsors, the Gerald Huff Fund for Humanity, Humanity Forward Foundation, Aid Kit, and Steady. I'd like to give a brief overview of the Crowdcast platform that we're on. If you would like to submit a question during the presentation to our speakers, use the Ask a Question section down below the bottom of your screen. You may also vote on questions that have already been posted by other attendees. This will help us know what questions you all are most interested in hearing about. Next is the chat box. Please use the chat box. What are your names? Where are you coming from? Your pronouns. We'd love to hear about you and bring you into the fold and learn about you as we have this journey for the next 45 minutes or so. In order to keep things moving, we do not intend to really respond actively to that chat. So please be sure to put any of those questions you've got in the Ask a Question spot. All right, so let's talk to these speakers. I'm going to introduce each of you and then we'll dive in. So Troy Henderson is an Australian Basic Income Lab, University of Sydney. He is, Dr. Troy Henderson is co-director of the Australian Basic Income Lab. He is a lecturer in political economy at the University of Sydney with a particular interest in basic income studies, macroeconomic policy, social policy reform, and the political economy of work. Thank you so much for being here today with us, Troy. Ben here we've got is a co-director of Australian Basic Income Lab, a collaboration between Macquarie University and the University of Sydney and Australian National University. Ben is also Associate Professor of Sociology at Macquarie University, Sydney. He has a PhD in economics from the University of Sydney, and his research focuses on the political economy of the welfare state. Thank you so much, Ben, for being here with us today. All right, and lastly, we've got Otto Lehto from New York University, and he is coming at us as a Finnish philosopher and political economist. He is currently a post-doctoral research fellow at New York University School of Law and an affiliated junior researcher at Fieldberg University Institute. He has a PhD in political economy from King's College London. Oh my gosh, all these things. Thank you so much, Otto, for being here with us today. All right, so first we have up Troy and Ben. You guys are going to dive into your presentation. I have a slide deck here that I'm going to pull up and share while you guys go through it. Give me just a moment to do that. All right, take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Kimberly. I'm just getting a bit of an echo here, so apologies. Hopefully you don't have an echo. And thanks to all of the organisers for putting on this fantastic conference. I've enjoyed a few of the sessions, despite the somewhat unfriendly hours for someone based in Australia. But I wanted to start off by acknowledging that I'm on Whadjuk land of the Noongar people in Perth, Western Australia, where it's a lovely 6 a.m. And to say that today we're not going to focus on discussing the optimal design for a basic income pilot, something which has been discussed in some detail at this conference, as it usually is at most major basic income conferences. But we're going to look at a few different potential avenues for advancing basic income as a policy reality, with a particular emphasis on the recent experience of COVID-19 in relation to natural experiments in social policy that in many cases approximated forms of basic income. I wanted to start, as was mentioned by Kimberly, that Ben, myself, and Elise, who couldn't be here today, are part of a new initiative called the Australian Basic Income Lab. Slide, please. And one of the initiatives that we're co-sponsoring is the Basic Income Earth Network Congress in Brisbane in late September, and we'd welcome any of you there, either in person or online. Slide 3. Okay, so as with many basic income scholars, researchers, and advocates, most of us don't come to this topic in a sort of neutral, objective, I'm just interested in the facts position. While academic rigor, scholarly rigor is important, we're also interested in whether this could actually become a policy reality in various countries, regions, cities. And a key question for many of us is there an optimal pathway for the current wave of public and political interest in basic income towards implementation of a permanent basic income scheme at scale? And this is a fundamental question and a complex question that probably has a multitude of different answers. Because one thing, anyone who has even a passing familiarity with the history of basic income would know that this is primarily a history of continuous failure in many different national, cultural, and political economic contexts. Slide 4, please. Okay, and I've just broken it down between these sort of 6 different, this sort of menu of implementation pathways, with pilots, political campaigns, the burgeoning literature on using microsimulations, natural experiments, which Ben is going to talk about in a moment, permanent programs, and something that probably hasn't been talked about all that much, which is phased implementation of basic income schemes. Final slide for me, slide number 5. Okay, and this goes into a little bit more detail in relation to this menu of options. So pilots, most of us are pretty familiar with. We've got the historical literature on the American negative income tax, North American negative income tax experiments in the 60s and 70s in the US and Canada. And then we've got things like the Finnish basic income experiment that Otto is so familiar with, the various trials that have been conducted by Give Directly and others in Kenya and Uganda, and then more recent experiments like the provincial level experiments in Ontario in Canada and in Spain and several other countries people could probably mention. And then I just wanted to look at pros and cons, which I probably won't read out in any detail, but you're welcome to the slides if you have an interest. But we all know there are certain strengths of something like a pilot, including the current wave of guaranteed minimum income experiments in the US, in terms of both the data that they afford researchers and those who are engaged in the evaluation of those projects, and in terms of their political, cultural, and social effects. And then there are various shortcomings in relation to these small-scale trials. They don't really create a political constituency for change. They can't replicate the macroeconomic impacts of a permanent, large-scale policy change. And then we can think about political or implementation pathways that might be open in relation to moving from something like a small-scale pilot to a permanent scheme. Obviously, permanence is a major one. That's a key criticism of trials that last 2 or 3 years. What can we really say about a scheme that should be permanent in terms of its social and behavioural effects if participants know from the outset that this is something that is going to last just a handful of years? And and how can we move to scaling up these small scale projects? Okay, political campaigns, very prominent ones. I still think the Swiss UBI referendum was one of the most significant developments in basic income studies and advocacy and activism in recent years. We've had Andrew Yang's presidential nomination campaign, and then more recently, the campaign for the Korean presidency, where the candidate advocating basic income just fell short of being elected. So the advantages could be their high profile, the high chance of a major breakthrough. Well, if there's success, the success could be large, but there's a high likelihood of failure. Then in terms of micro simulations, those have been useful in terms of being able to develop more fine-tuned, detailed programs for basic income schemes in different cultural, national, and political economic settings, which can inform political campaigns around basic income. Then when we get to natural experiments, where the coronavirus, despite being awful in so many ways, did provide an opportunity to observe a whole range of quite radical social policy interventions, including those conducted by conservative and centre-right governments, to see the impact of these policies in real time at scale. Second to last, we have permanent schemes such as Marika's basic income, the Gonji Youth basic income, both of which were phased up during the pandemic, and the well-known Alaska permanent fund dividend. And finally, I just wanted to mention this idea of phased implementation, which we can look at as either a process that is age-based, so certain cohorts. You might start with people approaching retirement and those who've just finished school and bring them together over time until you get a complete joined-up scheme. Or you could focus on different demographic groups, as is the case with many of the GMI experiments in the US at the moment that might focus mothers and children or other people who meet certain categorical standards with an idea that that's a starting point. It could be artists, as we've seen in some European examples. Okay, next slide, and handing over to Ben.
Thanks, Troy. Hi, everyone. So I'll go through this pretty quickly, but I suppose we're interested, particularly coming from our lab, in how you capitalize on the experiences of COVID to think through that as a pathway for being able to get wide-scale policy change. We saw very dramatic policy changes, I think particularly in English-speaking countries where we have pretty limited welfare states. And so there weren't already the policy mechanisms that were designed to be able to cope with such an enormous shock. And so you saw even quite conservative governments implement what would normally be seen as extraordinary radical change. You saw that happen at a large scale and involve millions of people. There's a little bit of information there about Canada's CERB program, the $500 a week payment that went to a very large number of people. It was a similar payment in Australia that doubled our unemployment benefit to about the same amount of money and got rid of most of the conditionality associated with it, massively expanded who was eligible for it, so that we saw millions of people accessing a payment that you'd say is more or less like a basic income. And the reasons we're interested in this is because, unlike almost anything else that's happened, it's large scale and real world. That is, most people had in the jurisdiction had a direct experience, a lived experience of what it was like. They either got the payment or probably know someone who did. That allows some of the macroeconomic, but also some of the health and social impacts of payments to be analysed. And we had real-time data that was being collected by a whole range of agencies, partly already in the field, but a whole bunch that went out in the field specifically because of COVID, that started collecting that data. It showed, at least in a very practical way, that you can do it. In Keynes's sense that anything we have done must be economically possible and must be affordable, because otherwise you couldn't do it. It sort of broke down some of the barriers around fiscal responsibility. But it was also obviously limited, not just by the fact that you couldn't see macroeconomic labour market effects, for example, because people weren't allowed to go out to work. But you also couldn't see some of the ongoing effects because people knew that it was limited. So it certainly isn't a basic income. Next slide, please. So again, if you're interested in this stuff, maybe get in touch with Troy and I. I'm not going to go through all of that in a lot of detail, but that gives you a little bit of a sense of the amounts we're talking. In the Australian context, it was a $550 a week payment. It didn't last for that long. We're talking kind of all up almost a year, but it was phased out from about 6 months in to gradually wind back to the level that was there before, only with a tiny addition. While it was in play, it not only got rid of conditionality, so work tests, it radically reduced means testing, and it also got rid of the thing called the partner test, which is where you can't access payments because your partner has income. So like a household means test. And all of those changes more or less mimic what we would think of as a basic income. Now, it's not entire, not everyone got it, but we're talking about something that's relatively similar. And we also got to see how much it cost. And these components of direct basic payments were a lot less expensive than the unemployment insurance versions of payments. We had one as well called JobKeeper, but there were ones in the United States or ones across Europe where we're paying employers to keep people on the books, those sorts of things. So while it was very substantial, we're not talking about a fiscal cost that is like just out of the question over an election cycle or two. Next slide. Sorry, yep, next, thank you. So those were the key elements of it. We raised the rate so it was adequate. We got rid of the activity tests, relaxed the means tests, and partner tests. So we had that. We saw a very significant decline in inequality, very significant declines in poverty. So poverty reducing by about 70 or 80%. We also saw a shift in the political conversation. We saw new actors that started to take it on. The Unemployed Workers Union, the Australian Greens, which is a reasonably sizable third party in Australia and has a significant parliamentary presence. Anglicare is the largest non-profit provider of services in Australia. United Workers Union, again, is a large trade union actor. So we had a number of shifts in civil society, shifts in public opinion, that were accompanied by that suggests there's a possibility of a pro-reform coalition to mobilise behind reforms like this. And the Australian Greens took a version of this to the last election where they did quite well. And I suppose one of the things we're particularly interested in, I think we're about to finish here, is thinking of how each of those elements, relaxing means tests, increasing the base rate, draw in more people, which creates an expanded beneficiary pool of people who then campaign to do the other things, that is to get rid of conditionality, to make sure payments are adequate. And there's a kind of reinforcing cycle that potentially builds a political coalition around an umbrella of basic income. So that's something we're going to be investigating, how that might be mobilized most effectively. And the last slide is just the BN conference. So please come along. We'll be having more conversations like this there, as well as the one we're about to have here. So thanks very much.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that presentation. We will move to Otto, and then we'll take some questions from the audience.
All right, thank you very much. And it's really good to be here. And I think my presentation will be a good follow-up to the previous one, because I will pick up one part of that, or one strand of this categorization of different types of experiments. And I will talk about permanent programs as a type of experiment. So I will talk about large-scale experiments, most often nationwide, but the unit could be a federation, it could be even an international arrangement for sure. But I think, so I won't have any slides to share because my project is still in that sort of thinking phase, shall we say, but I think it's going to be pretty easy to follow. And I think it's going to be interesting both for scientists and activists. And I think we're probably going to have both groups in the audience today here. So what do I mean by thinking of permanent programs as experiments? Well, there's kind of a paradox as I see it with the current approach to doing experiments, which is you're trying to be humble and you're trying to tackle small problems. And both sort of from a scientific point of view, you are trying to express humility by tackling small problems, engaging in this kind of piecemeal interventionism, adding small policy changes, reforms on top of another, and thereby trying to sort of create positive change, respecting the current institutions, the current attitudes, and trying to build these new changing attitudes slowly into the current system. And there is a lot to speak in favor of such an attitude. But I think there's the paradox there that I see is this, that although there's humility in trying to tackle small problems and trying to proceed in this reformist piecemeal fashion, what Karl Popper famously called piecemeal social engineering, I think there's a kind of inbuilt tendency of this model to actually feed the opposite of what is intended, which is one of its main problems, namely that the focus on small-scale interventionism tends to create an atmosphere where the political realm becomes overtaken by this kind of rather aggressively interventionist attitude, whereby the focus on the basic rules often gets lost. The focus on the institutional structure, whether we're talking of constitutional rules, whether we're talking of human rights, or some other realm of more permanent structures, or even the sort of permanent social insurance schemes and their permanence, often gets lost in these debates which start thinking of the small-scale whether it's pilots, small-scale emergency basic income, or small-scale policy reform here or there. So I think there's a tendency to kind of, first of all, sort of fragmentize the policy arena, and thereby sort of undermine the stability of the possibility for permanence. And on the other hand, to give more power, paradoxically, to technocratic scientists, policymakers, experts, who then have power over the democratic people themselves often, and are tasked, although seemingly with small, modest tasks, often with real power over real people. And I think this is a real problem for the so-called humility of this approach. And in this sense, I think that even randomized control trials are very problematic. Of course, there's another dimension in the global arena with randomized controlled trials, which has to do with the whole kind of post-colonial legacy and the problematic relation between the North and the South, between industrialized countries and developing countries, and so on. But I won't go into that issue here now. Instead, I want to say that if we look at all the problems that this current approach has, there's a case to be made for focusing more on that idea of the permanent structure being the proper arena in which to do experiments. And when I mean experiments, I have to be careful here by what I mean. So going back to Popper, who I already mentioned, who talked about piecemeal social engineering, he contrasted this approach with what he called utopian social engineering. And utopian social engineering, of course, has a bad legacy, and for good reason, given what we know about many of the large-scale experiments in institutional restructuring, in revolutionary reform, and the worry that has come out of the legacy of the obvious case being the communist experiments in different countries, but also many of the non-communist experiments in the rest of the world, which often led to very dangerous and difficult structural changes, which might have appeared necessary as a way to break out of the path dependency of institutional structures, and given the strong emotional and ethical appeal of these large-scale reforms, similar to what some people in the basic income movement today feel, it might be tempting to say we need to jump onto this mode of revolutionary change. So I want to be clear that I'm not saying that revolutionary change is necessarily an obvious choice to make. It has many obvious downsides, and therefore we need to be very clear and careful with what we mean by saying that we should focus more on large-scale, long-term institutional basic structure reforms to change the permanent structure of the social order. So I think that the danger of utopian social engineering is real, but I don't think it's a necessary trap. I think there's ways of overcoming it. The most obvious one is focusing on the democratic structure of change, and that is to say, focus more on the realm of democratic self-governance. Think of ways in which different countries can set up for themselves processes which are rule-based, in which they can set up committees, they can set up perhaps even democratic forums of discussion and deliberation in which large-scale reforms can be debated, and with due respect for the practices, institutional habits and customs, and judicial review, and all these other parts of what is going on in the world today. And I think sorry, Troy made a really funny note. So yes, I think there's ways of making these changes more democratic, and indeed think of experiment as being a democratic self-experiment. Think of experiment not as something that a group of scientists or a group of policymakers in coalition with scientists design and then set up a control group, a target group, and so on, and nor think of it in terms of a particular policy arena in which we can set up these small-scale mini basic incomes or quasi-basic incomes to sort of fill in the gaps of pandemic preparedness or healthcare preparedness or whatever might be the case. Instead, I think we can think on this long-term fashion, and indeed it is in line with what history has shown has worked in the past. The real experiments that I draw your attention to are not the failures, obvious ones of the Soviet Union and so on, but rather the rather obvious successes from a pure descriptive point of view, to say nothing of their merit of, on the one hand, these sort of Bismarckian reforms, which were preceded by no randomized control trials whatsoever. The same, of course, goes for the FDR reforms, the Beveridgean reforms, and indeed the Thatcherite Reaganite revolution, which in many ways was similarly handled with bold leadership and with striking results, for good or ill. Again, I'm simply describing the capacity of these processes of enacting change. And so, of course, there's a bit of a tension here, and I'm sort of coming to sort of a conclusion of what I want to say here, is that all these successes have clearly been the result not of sort of idealized democratic self-governance where the vision comes from the bottom up, but rather of highly representative democratic representation, in which case the question arises, do we need a focus on leadership? Do we need a focus on these political moments of revolutionary or semi-quasi-revolutionary change in which you have combination of leadership and popular support for a particular type of large-scale reform? And as we know from all of these examples that I mentioned, from FDR to Reagan and Thatcher, there's a long legacy of also opposition that arises as a result of it. So if basic income were to be implemented by sort of a neo-FDR Beveridgean coalition, or on the other hand, by a sort of neo-Thatcherite Reaganite coalition, you would be sure that there would be also strong opposition to it. But all of those institutions, or a lot of those institutions, are still there. So a lot of the institutions laid down by FDR, Beveridge, but on the other hand, by Reagan and Thatcher, are still there despite that opposition. So it might be possible for some sort of coalition to set up a basic income with large support, but also large opposition, and it would still perhaps be sort of retained despite that opposition. Now, that's not the ideal way to do it, but I think that might be indeed not only the only way for the people inside the community to really get it done, but also a good way for other countries to observe and see, that's what happened there. At least we have now, from their point of view, a natural experiment going on there in which we just sit back and relax and maybe see if there's anything there that we can copy for our own country. So I will stop there, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So many amazing points you've made. It's really fascinating, the opportunity that COVID has brought to the world stage in economic justice, with all of the action that took place around the world. And it's really exciting to see glimmers of success and like you said, help to put those things in place that are going to last, even if there's a little opposition to them, because not everything, typically things are not put into place with everybody agreeing on all the things. So finding the nuggets that we can agree on and move forward with are really, really important. So thank you so much. There are a couple of comments and questions in the chat. First thing I want to address is I'm so sorry there was a cutoff in the slide deck. I'm just seeing that there was a comment around that. Troy, do you mind if I share the slide deck with the audience so that they can pull it up themselves and just see that image themselves? Is that all right with you? Perfect. I'm just going to send that to you all. Feel free to pull that up and you guys can see that full image at the top there. There's a really interesting comment. I'm not sure there's much of a question, Diane, here in your comment. If you could maybe clarify in the chat as I read what you've got here and add anything. But what Otto says about the downside of respecting the current institutions while reforming resonates, because the permanent structure in the U.S. assistance program is designed to be insufficient and enroll very few people. and to do emotional and physical harm. Like, it's literally designed that way. They kind of just said, this is why we really want to do it, and it's going to be that way. So I was adding that. So quite awful. It's quite awful to in her mind, it's quite awful to try to respect those structures that really are designed poorly. Can you speak to that a little?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things there. First of all, I think there's a difference between focusing on respecting a particular set of structures and simply focusing our attention anew on the level of those structures. And indeed, I think there's good lessons here for people who want to change the current structures, who don't want to respect them so much, because a lot of this effort to implement sort of in the interstices of the system, these new policy measures, through emergency measures or through policy interventions on top of the existing structures, I feel that they're kind of like they're having to fit themselves in this, as she rightfully puts it, like in this. The power of the existing structure remains, and it's sort of, you can feel it still there, even as all these new measures are being added. So in many ways, the focus on seeing basic income as this kind of thing on top, or thing that can happen through the current system, I think is precisely mistaken, in the sense that it's not taking paying full attention to the path dependency issues. It's not paying full attention to the difference between the foundational structure of rules and these more sort of temporary, ephemeral programs, which can of course be very quickly lit up like a candle, but a modest gust of wind will put the fire out. So in the same sense, I think basic income schemes should not be thought of as easily lit up things, because then they can also be easily put out.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And what strikes me is we had a conversation yesterday at here in Portland at one of the live sessions, and they were talking about how there's a lot of shift in how different programs that exist now, like in our human services programs, there's a lot of shift in actually doing cash portions to their programs. And it was great to hear that in Oregon, there's some programs being run by different government programs that are trying to help homeless people, and just giving them money as a part of that. And they didn't used to do that, but now they are, because they're seeing the success in it, and their department is allowing them to write those checks, and do something a little bit different, which is really, really great. So there's another question here, and I think this is more for you, Troy and Ben. It's from Jessica. Do we think it'll be more difficult to maintain the UBI movement generated from the natural experiments due to the current level of inflation macroeconomic environment?
Shall I go, Ben, or do you want to go first? Okay, I think that's a really good question. It does complicate the debate to some extent, because essentially Australia, like most other wealthy countries around the world, has had no problem with inflation since at least the 1980s. So I think this particular inflationary bout is a little bit, what do I say, unique in that there are a lot of supply chain and supply side issues that are helping to drive inflation. So I would just say, this gives me the opportunity to quickly say a couple of things about this natural experiment in the Australian context. You suddenly had a situation where you have a centre-right government completely ignoring its own nostrums regarding fiscal rectitude and all this kind of stuff, implementing a hugely interventionist program which eliminates income poverty in Australia. in a couple of months, which is quite a stunning thing and has very positive impact on well-being and is actually fiscally affordable. But to set against that, we need to acknowledge that that was completely rolled back. As Ben said, almost as it was rolled out, it started to be withdrawn. And by the end of it, Australia still has the second lowest unemployment benefit in the OECD at the end of this natural experiment. So as Ben has written before, we both abolished income poverty and then recreated it. And I think what the key question that raises is, without some kind of social or political movement, maybe getting to what Otto was talking about in relation to a democratic campaign for this type of policy agenda, you have a situation where these radical out of the blue policy shifts are very unlikely to be permanent. So that's, I don't know if Ben has anything to add.
Yeah, I was maybe just going to add that I think part of the inflation scare is precisely because there is some prospect of positive change that requires a pushback. So that the fiscal constraints which have been used to show that the stuff that was done during COVID was impossible could be reinstated, and people wouldn't get the idea that they could keep on doing them. I mean, I think that is part of the backlash that Otto's been talking about, but this had begun very quickly, particularly in the US. You saw it begin very, very quickly and assertively, but it's going on all over the place. And the degree to which it's asserted is got more to do with the political context, which is why it's so strong in the US. It's not as strong in some other places where fiscal rectitude is usually upheld very, very keenly. So that, I think that is useful. Like, that shows us that something's happening. In fact, if there's no backlash against what you're doing, it almost certainly means that no one in power is very worried about it, and it's unlikely to go anywhere. So, I mean, I think that's a good sign. The only other thing that wasn't completely rolled back in Australia, and I'm not sure about the experience internationally, is so we now have this situation where unemployment fell again, as it did everywhere, to almost record low levels. But those on the benefit that's associated with unemployment, which was the same one used to roll out this, has stayed very high. And that seems to be because there were a whole lot of people who before COVID were eligible technically for the benefit, but didn't take it because they were either unaware of it or they saw it as so stigmatized that they didn't want to be associated with it. That stigma fell away during COVID. They signed up and they're still eligible. Now, I think that's one of the things which is the interesting political dynamic we haven't seen yet, but that is the more people who are on a scheme that looks like basic income, the harder it is to make it really bad. Yeah. So I think part of our job is just to be able to create rules and construct rules that enlarge the constituency of people who have direct experience with this. And I think that's partly what we want to play around with. It is kind of the opposite. It's a bit reformist compared to Otto's vision, but I do think there is a sense in which they're both at least trying to change the structures and deal with the kind of inbuilt biases of those structures rather than trying to tinker around somewhere else in experiment.
What comes to mind, I mean, Troy, when you were talking about the implementation and the takeaway, like that was here in America with our child tax credit. It was here for 6 months on a monthly basis, up to $300 per child for families, and it just went away. And now with inflation rising, as you say, it's more about the politics. It's more about manipulation. We're understanding with profit margins growing, like they're making more money, but things like it's specifically gas, barrel prices are down, but the cost at the gas pump continues to rise, which means their profits are going up. But we are getting we are not able to battle that here on the ground, and it's really hard. Something that you said about stories kind of brings up a question that we kind of thought about before. We are running out of time. Real quickly, recipient stories are often the most powerful outcome from pilots and these short-term schemes that governments are doing. however, many recipients might be uncomfortable with sharing their stories. Do you guys, did you, in your research, did you come across schemes that help to share those stories, and what was successful?
Yeah, can I just say quickly that Elise Klein, who is our other colleague at the Australian Basic Income Lab, she was a central person who was studying a cohort of individuals who did receive this increased income support payment at its height. And the critical other thing we have to say is it reduced all the conditionality. It removed the conditionality, the workfare obligations. So time was yours. Time was, you had time to do the things you needed to do more of, which invariably for women had to do with care work in its, poor distribution between men and women in Australia as elsewhere. And there were clear positive self-reported well-being benefits, particularly in relation to mental health. And yeah, so that type of qualitative evidence, as is the case in many other countries, was all there. As Ben said, it was impossible in the middle of a pandemic when people are being told to stay home to measure things like labour market effects, as they did in the Finnish trial. But, we've got so much of that from history. We know people work a bit less. It depends on the quantum of the basic income. So having some of this qualitative detail was nice. If I could finish in 10 seconds, because I was just interested to hear from Otto. Do you think that the municipal level is the ideal level for implementation of some type of basic income?
That's a very good question.
The answer to that is no, because I don't think municipal level is currently equipped in most countries to handle the whole tax and transfer scheme on a permanent level. I just think that would decentralize the tax and transfer scheme so much that I don't think it's likely. Although I think municipalities should play an important role. Let me just say one thing about the data collection. I know we're coming to an end, but I think actually this is often overlooked, that we get lots of good data from these large-scale democratic experiments. That is, we can read so many stories and so many surveys of how people feel about the NHS in the Britain, how they feel about the New Deal programs, and we can track those over decades, right? So in this sense, the data that we get from these kind of experiments is also very valuable historically, and it's the only way we can get this kind of really large-scale good data. So that's also another reason, I think, to think that those will be valuable scientific tools also in the long run. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, you guys, for being here. Thank you for being up in the middle of the night. We appreciate you. And thank you to our audience for coming and listening and your wonderful questions. Join us for our last plenary in just a few minutes, Rethinking Basic Income Challenges to University and Uniformity of Payment. I'm going to put the link into the chat. We will be wrapping up with a little time in our Kumo space. Please feel free to hop over there now and then join us as well afterwards. There's some links for you to the next plenary, to the full session schedules, catch up on all the things. There's been so many amazing sessions, very, very fruitful discussions. Thank you again to Otto, to Troy, to Ben. You guys have been amazing.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
We'll see you next time, and we'll see you in the chat space, in Kumo space. I hope to see you at the gathering.
See you in Australia in September.
Yes. All right. Let's do it. Bye, y'all.
See ya.